What you are about to see is a case study in systemic failure. The location is Iowa, a state long marketed as the stable, reliable heartland of America. The subjects are over 10,000 of its own citizens who have been rendered homeless by economic forces. But into this already failing system, a new lethal variable has been introduced: fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so powerful it functions less like a drug and more like a chemical weapon.
Well, I lost my job during COVID.
Stay out of harm's way. I stay on the streets. I sleep in the park benches, bus stops. I walked.
This is not a story about the tragedy of homelessness. This is an investigation into a public health catastrophe. We will analyze how a crisis of housing created a population of vulnerable targets and how the arrival of fentanyl turned that vulnerability into a kill zone. This is the story of how the American heartland became a laboratory for a disaster, and what happens when the quiet machinery of bureaucratic failure collides with the deadliest drug ever seen on the streets. The collision. Corsa housing crisis meets a poison. For years, the narrative of Iowa has been one of stability. It's a place you move to for a sensible cost of living, safe communities, and a predictable future. That narrative is now dangerously obsolete. We must first analyze the pre-existing condition, the housing crisis. As we speak, over 10,000 Iowans are without a stable home. This isn't the visible crisis you see in major coastal cities. This is a scattered, hidden emergency playing out in rural counties and small-town parking lots. The primary demographic is not who you might think. It's working families, the elderly, and individuals for whom a single unexpected bill was enough to sever their connection to stable housing. In Polk County alone, the epicenter of this housing failure homelessness has surged by a staggering 13% in a single year. This statistic is the first piece of evidence. It proves that the social safety net had already broken long before the fentanyl crisis reached its current intensity. Now introduce the second variable, a flood of cheap, potent fentanyl. The housing crisis created the perfect target population: a large group of people living in constant physical and psychological distress, disconnected from healthcare systems, and concentrated in environments with little to no oversight. Think about your own life's stability. How many missed paychecks? How many medical emergencies are you from the edge? For thousands in Iowa, that edge has already been crossed. They are now living on a collision course where the slow-motion disaster of poverty is being met by the high-speed lethality of a synthetic poison. To understand the death toll, you must first understand that these are not two separate crises. They are one and the same. The data of desperation. To fully comprehend the scale of this failure, we need to examine the data. These are not just numbers. They are the metrics of a system's breakdown and the coordinates of the current kill zone. By the close of 2024, official counts, which are notoriously conservative, logged nearly 3,000 individuals as unhoused across Iowa. This data point is critical because it comes from a region where housing insecurity was supposed to be a rarity, not a growing epidemic. Let's drill down. In the Two Rivers region, a largely rural area, over 700 people were identified as homeless. 700. This isn't a rounding error in a metropolis. This is a significant portion of the population in small communities, now living without the basic human right of shelter. This is the tangible result of a social contract being broken. The crisis isn't abstract, it's operational. It is the family trying to sleep in a car in a Hy-Vee parking lot. It is the individual setting up a tent in the freezing cold miles from any service. In the capital Des Moines, the data signals a system in freefall. The 13% annual increase in homelessness is not just a statistic. It's an alarm bell that has been ringing for years. It represents a wage-to-rent gap that has become a chasm. While low-end wages have barely moved, the average cost of rent has skyrocketed by over 30% in 3 years. This isn't just economic hardship. This is the manufacturing of desperation. And desperation is the currency that fentanyl dealers trade in. Every percentage point increase in rent, every family added to the waitlist for affordable housing, is another potential customer for the cartels. The data doesn't just show a housing crisis, It maps the exact territory where a public health disaster was not just likely, but inevitable. The architecture of the fall. It is a critical error to view fentanyl addiction as the cause of homelessness. Analytically, that is backward. Fentanyl is the logical, deadly endpoint of a systemic process that strips people of their stability and hope. Let's examine the architecture of that falls. The process rarely begins with a chemical. It begins with a systemic shock, a factory layoff, a sudden rent hike, a medical bankruptcy, a mental health crisis that goes untreated. These are not individual moral failures. They are predictable failure points in our economic and healthcare systems. Once an individual or family is pushed out of stable housing, they enter a state of constant high-stakes crisis management. The search for shelter, safety, and food consumes all of their physical and mental energy. It is in this state of extreme vulnerability that the market logic of fentanyl becomes brutally effective. Why fentanyl? Because the system has inadvertently made it the most logical choice for someone seeking to numb unbearable pain. It is cheaper than a bottle of liquor. It is more accessible than a therapist. It is more potent than any other painkiller on the street. Mental health care in rural Iowa is a luxury. Fentanyl is a commodity. The path to the street is paved with systemic failures. The wage-rent gap, the multi-year wait lists for subsidized housing, the lack of accessible mental health services. These aren't just unfortunate circumstances. They are the structural components of a system that is by its very design producing a steady stream of vulnerable people. What do you believe is the single biggest misconception society has about why people end up on the streets? The reality is that the system doesn't just fail to provide a safety net, it creates the very conditions that make the fall inevitable. And at the bottom of that fall, fentanyl is waiting. The Accelerant: How a Pandemic Broke the Last Defenses. The system was already failing, but the COVID-19 pandemic acted as a massive accelerant, stress testing our social infrastructure and exposing its terminal weaknesses. For the unhoused, the pandemic was not a health crisis. It was an extinction-level event for their support systems. While policymakers focused on stay-at-home orders, they systematically dismantled the last informal infrastructure of survival for people with no homes to go to. The closure of public libraries wasn't an inconvenience. It was the severing of the only reliable source of electricity, communication, and sanitation. The closure of community centers wasn't a precaution. It was the elimination of the only safe, warm spaces available. This created a vacuum. Social services already underfunded either collapsed or moved online, rendering them useless to a population without reliable internet or devices. In-person counseling, detox support, and mobile health units vanished. Let's be clear about what happened next. Into this vacuum of support, isolation, and despair, fentanyl flooded the market. It was a calculated move by suppliers who understood that demand had just been artificially supercharged by public policy. The evidence is in the data. Between 2019 and 2024, as the aftershocks of the pandemic response ravaged vulnerable communities, overdose deaths from fentanyl in Iowa shot up by 23%. This was not a coincidence. It was a direct, predictable outcome. The pandemic did not just expose flaws, it broke the last lines of defense. It proved that our social safety net was a fiction. And it created the perfect isolated conditions for a deadly opioid epidemic to fuse with an existing housing crisis, triggering the catastrophe we see today. Threat multiplier weather as a weapon. In a tactical analysis of this crisis, the Iowa weather cannot be considered a passive background element. It functions as a threat multiplier, an environmental weapon that actively synergizes with fentanyl to increase its lethality. First, consider the winter. When temperatures drop to minus 25 degrees Celsius, survival becomes the only objective. This extreme cold forces unhoused individuals into dangerous isolation, a tent, a car, and abandoned structure. This isolation is a known critical risk factor for fatal overdose. Using fentanyl alone is a gamble. The cold forces people to take that gamble every single night. There is no one to administer Narcan, no one to call for help. The cold provides cover for the kill. Next, the summer. The oppressive heat and humidity create a state of constant physical misery. Heat stroke and dehydration are rampant. This intense, prolonged physical distress creates a powerful physiological demand for an anesthetic, a numbing agent. Fentanyl meets that demand with brutal efficiency. The heat doesn't just make life miserable, it drives up the demand for the very substance most likely to kill. Finally, consider the severe weather events like the tornado that devastated Greenfield. These events function as disruptors of the last fragile supply lines of aid. A storm doesn't just knock out power, it prevents outreach vans carrying Narcan from reaching their destinations. It takes down cell towers, cutting off the only communication link between a person in crisis and emergency services. The environment in Iowa is not a neutral stage for this tragedy. It is an active participant. It isolates, it distresses, and it disrupts. It takes the existing dangers of homelessness and the chemical threat of fentanyl and multiplies them, creating a lethal equation that people are forced to solve every single day just to stay alive. A case study in systemic failure. Statistics can numb us to the reality of a crisis. So let's move from the abstract to the specific. How does a system theoretically designed to help become an active barrier to surviving the fentanyl crisis? To understand this, we need to analyze the case of Shannon Carlson. For over 17 years, Shannon has navigated the treacherous landscape of homelessness in Iowa. Her story didn't begin with addiction, it began with the kinds of fractures that can happen to anyone: trauma, domestic violence, economic hardship. She was once a small business owner, a person with plans with receipts kept in careful order. Now consider her current reality through the lens of a public health catastrophe. Shannon's greatest struggles are a lack of a cell phone and a government-issued ID. In the past, this was a barrier to employment. Today, it is a potential death sentence. Without a phone, she is a ghost in the system. An outreach worker can't send a text alert about a contaminated batch of drugs circulating in the area. She can't call 911 if she finds someone unresponsive. She can't be contacted for a spot that just opened up in a treatment facility. The lack of a $15 a month phone plan severs her from the entire emergency response network. Without an ID, she is not a person in the eyes of the bureaucracy. She can't get into most long-term shelters. She can't access addiction treatment programs that require state identification. She can't even pick up a prescription for life-saving medication. She tells us she's had job offers, but without proof of identity, they evaporate. This isn't just a hurdle, it's a firewall that locks her out of every possible off-ramp from the streets. Think about the sheer absurdity of this. A person needs an ID to get into a program that could save their life from fentanyl, but they need a home address to get an ID. It is a perfect, inescapable bureaucratic trap. Shannon's story is not a tale of personal failure. It is a case study of a system whose own rules and requirements are incompatible with the chaotic reality of the lives it's supposed to save. It is a system that, in the face of a fast-moving killer like fentanyl, responds with the slow, grinding, and indifferent machinery of paperwork. What does a person's dream of a quiet life of running a salon matter to a system that can't even see them? The lethal architecture of displacement, let's be clear. In many Iowa communities, current public policy is not merely failing to solve homelessness. It is actively creating more efficient killing fields for fentanyl. This isn't hyperbole. This is the operational reality of laws designed to address the visibility of homelessness rather than homelessness itself. Ordinances that prohibit public camping or loitering are built on a fundamentally flawed premise. They operate as if a person without a home has somewhere else to go. The result is not a solution, but a constant forced migration known as displacement. Now analyze what this displacement does in a fentanyl-saturated environment. First, it severs trust and communication. An outreach team might spend weeks building a relationship with a group of individuals in one location, providing them with Narcan fentanyl test strips and information. A single police sweep erases all of that progress. The individuals scatter, now more wary of authority and less likely to engage with services. Second, it pushes people into deeper isolation. When a person is forced to move from a semi-public space like an underpass They retreat to places where they are less likely to be found deep in the woods, inside abandoned industrial buildings, in derelict vehicles. Fentanyl overdoses are often reversible if caught in time. When a person uses alone in a hidden location, their chance of being found and revived drops to virtually zero. The policy has created a private, secluded space for them to die. This is the lethal architecture of displacement. It is a system of enforcement that functions as an unwitting accomplice to the opioid crisis. We must ask a brutally honest question: what is the true purpose of these policies? Is it to help people, or is it to move a problem from one part of the city map to another until the person at the center of that problem simply disappears for good? When the choice is between sleeping in a visible park where a passerby might call for help or a hidden ditch where no one will ever find you, our policies are forcing people to choose the ditch. And in that choice, we see the system's ultimate tragic failure. India hum. The overwhelmed medics of a shadow. Irawa, the official response to the dual crisis of homelessness and fentanyl, is tragically under-resourced. The real fight is being waged on the ground by what can only be described as battlefield medics in a shadow war. These are the staff and volunteers of Iowa's nonprofits and shelters. Organizations like Joppa Outreach were never designed to be frontline emergency medical services. They were created to provide food, shelter, and a path back to stability. But today their mission has been radically redefined by chemistry. Their outreach vans are now mobile supply units stocked not just with water and socks, but with life-saving doses of Narcan. Their staff are trained not just in social work, but in overdose response. They are reversing overdoses in library parking lots and behind gas stations. The shelters themselves are at a breaking point. They are operating on static budgets while facing a 13% surge in demand. But it's more than a numbers problem. It's a problem of acuity. They are not equipped to be detox facilities. A traditional shelter environment with its open dorms and minimal staffing is dangerously unsuited to manage the volatility of fentanyl addiction and withdrawal. They are being asked to do the job of a hospital without the resources of a clinic. The housing first model is the only strategy with a proven track record of success. It acknowledges the simple truth that you cannot expect a person to fight a war against addiction while they are simultaneously fighting a war for basic survival. Yet this model is being strangled by the single greatest failure of the system: a catastrophic lack of available affordable housing units. It's like having a cure for a disease but no syringes to administer it. When you look at these organizations, you don't see a robust social safety net. You see a triage station in the middle of a disaster zone. They are plugging a dam with their fingers while the floodwaters of systemic failure, stagnant wages, impossible housing costs, and a tidal wave of cheap, deadly opioids continue to rise. What happens when these medics finally burn out? Who will be left to answer the call? A census of the forgotten. So where does this leave us? We are faced with a crisis that we have allowed to fester in the shadows. We have used the word homeless as a label to create distance, to make the problem about someone else's choices, someone else's character. But fentanyl has changed the equation. This is no longer a slow-motion tragedy of poverty. It is a fast-moving public health execution. The forces at play: economic instability, a housing crisis, a mental health epidemic, and a flood of synthetic opioids have created a perfect storm. And the people living on our streets are the ones caught in the eye of it. Their humanity has not been extinguished. It is visible in the smallest acts of solidarity in the encampments, the sharing of a blanket, a warning about a dangerous situation, the grief for a friend who didn't wake up. These are the last vestiges of community among a population that has been systematically disconnected from society. True change will not come from simply looking away. It will not come from judging the person you see on the street. It demands that we confront the brutal reality of the systems we have built. It demands that we stop asking, why don't they just get a job, and start asking, why have we made it impossible for a person to get an ID? Or why does our emergency housing system have a 6-month waiting list? This is not about charity, it is about justice. It is about recognizing that a society can be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens, especially when those citizens are dying from a preventable cause. The path forward is not easy. It requires massive investment in truly affordable housing. It requires treating addiction as a medical condition, not a crime. It requires building a mental health care system that actually reaches people where they are. But before any of that can happen, a more fundamental shift must occur. It must happen in here, in our own hearts and minds. We must decide that these lives matter. We must conduct our own census of the forgotten and count every single person as one of our own. In the heartland of America, a quiet war is raging, and the casualties are mounting. The crisis in Iowa is not an anomaly, it is a preview. It is a stark demonstration of what happens when systemic neglect collides with a deadly synthetic poison. The stories you have heard are an indictment of our indifference. Behind every overdose statistic is a person who once had a dream. A person who was a son, a daughter, a parent, a friend. Fentanyl was not their choice. It was the last and most lethal option presented to them by a world that had run out of answers. If this documentary has left you with a sense of unease or anger or a desire to act, do not let it fade. The first step in solving a problem is refusing to ignore it. Help us fight the silence. Like this video and share it. Force this conversation into the open. Subscribe to Bear City 24 because we will continue to go to the places that have been forgotten, and we will continue to tell the stories that must be heard. Thank you for bearing witness.